So much for the introduction, Bill. It's great to be here tonight with so many of you on the great wide internet, as we're getting so used to now. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, I gather that Sunday is not the best day for exciting gulls in Brantford, so I guess I should have gotten off the couch on Saturday, but never mind. There's always next Saturday. Just going to share my screen and then we'll get going. Okay, hopefully you can now see my screen. So yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. As I mentioned, it's super to be here tonight. I just want to start off by acknowledging my status as a visitor everywhere I am, starting in fact at home in Scotland. I grew up exploring wild places from where people were forcibly cleared to make way for sheep farming and saw firsthand the ecological impact of that almost 200 years later. And as a recent immigrant to Canada, I continue to regard myself as a visitor in both time and place. And I really strive to do my best to learn about the cultures and people that came before me and surround me today, and to treat lands and people with dignity and respect. So lots to learn about that still. So jumping in, I'm going to touch on quite a lot of different ideas tonight. So hopefully there'll be something of interest to all of you, whether you're interested in birds or plants or just general ecology. And finish off, as Bill mentioned, with some ideas about bits and pieces that you can all do at home or at the cottage or whatever, if you're so inclined. So starting off to chat a little bit about pollinators. That was, I think, some of the original things that I was asked to speak about tonight. So I figured it was a good idea to start at the beginning and chat about, well, what is a pollinator? What do we mean by that? I'm sure many of you have more expertise in this than I do, so bear with me. Plants make flowers in order to reproduce, and flowers contain pollen which needs to be moved to a different flower before a seed can develop, generally speaking. That's the kind of layman version of what pollination is all about. And so pollen can be moved around in all sorts of different ways. And one way that can be super visible, like in these photos, is by either wind or water. These are some little ornamental conifers in a hotel in Thunder Bay that I saw a few years ago, and I happened to be there right at the peak pollen sharing time. In fact, there was so much pollen floating around that it was floating around in the lake and looked like someone had poured a bunch of paint into the lake. It's quite extraordinary. And this is the kind of pollen that tends to make you sneeze. This is the pollen that makes you reach for the Kleenex because it's small, it's light, it's really round and easy to float around in the air. And that tends to be on plants that don't produce big showy flowers. It's often the things that you don't even notice when you're walking around that release clouds of pollen and mean that you have kind of a miserable time at various points in the year if you're so inclined. So what is a pollinator? So all sorts of animals all around the world are involved with moving pollen around. So that includes things like small mammals, including bats. Some birds are important pollinators in different parts of the world, but probably the most famous group of animals that we think of as pollinators are, of course, insects. And the key thing about animal pollinators, whether it's a bird or an insect or a mammal, is that they need to be attracted to plants. So those kind of plants tend to produce big, showy, smelly flowers. So the kind of plants that we often want to grow in our garden, for example, are the things that attract animals. So big, showy flowers make this kind of pollen. And of course, in this case, the pollen has evolved to stick easily onto feathers or fur or onto little the cuticles of insects. So it tends to be big, it tends to be heavy, it tends to have all sorts of little sticky hooks and things like that on it. So it's easy to move around. And this is the kind of stuff that therefore is really hard to get into your nostrils and make you sneeze. So big, showy, stinky flowers, we tend not to cause allergic reactions in people. And this will be important a bit later on. It seems like an arbitrary thing to belabor right now, but we'll get there. So we've probably heard a bunch about bees and pollinator decline in the media, in science, and this is indeed the case. This is a pretty scary change that we're seeing in ecosystems. In fact, in many parts of the world, not just right here in Ontario. So not only are insect pollinators particularly important for the pollination services that they carry out, but of course other wildlife eats the resulting seeds, birds and mammals, ranging from tiny little voles and mice and things right up to bears that are dependent on fruit and seeds and nuts and berries at different points in the year. And of course, they're critically important also to our food industry. These are some random numbers I dredged off the internet a little while ago. In the US, for example, is around 100 crops are completely dependent on insect pollinators of some sort. And I'm sure that that number is different wherever you're looking. And it's not just domestic honeybees, it's also wild pollinators, so wild insects that have evolved here naturally that are actually also really important in pollinating some of the food that we eat. And that's estimated to be worth billions of dollars per year in the US and Canada. So these little guys are pretty important directly for us, even if you actually don't care about wildlife all around us, and I'm sure that's not the case for many of us here tonight. So I mentioned already domestic honeybees. So these are an important part of pollination services when it comes to producing the food that we depend on. But it's worth remembering that here in North America, honeybees are a domestic introduced animal. And managed colonies of this domestic animal have in fact suffered really serious declines recently, and that is really worrisome. However, as a conservationist, conservation biologist, and arguably also as somebody that eats food, I'm actually a lot more concerned about the native bee species and other pollinators here in North America that are also declining rapidly. So there's around 4,000 species of bee in North America, about 400 and so in Ontario. And these wild animals are also declining rapidly, to the extent, in fact, that some of our bees are actually listed as endangered. And again, that includes species right here on our doorstep here in southern and central Ontario. I've alluded to this already as well. It's not actually just bees. There's some really important insect groups that are also pollinators. So flies, beetles, butterflies, not all butterflies, but some are actually important pollinators. And of course, not to be overlooked, this blowfly is actually, groups of blowflies are also really important pollinators, including for the very rare southwestern Ontario tree species, the pawpaw. They're actually dependent on blowflies and other things that are attracted to the really stinky flowers to bring about pollination. And I'll flop around whether I talk about pollinators or bees or insects, but in general, the message is the same, that if you're an insect of some sort, then on average you're declining right now, which is really unfortunate and scary. And of course, as we've already been chatting about birds this evening, one of the other reasons, apart from the fact that we all need to eat food, is that many of us also like to look at birds. And some of these declines in insect biodiversity, insect abundance, are also being linked increasingly strongly with really steep declines in particular insectivorous birds. So why might this be happening? There's of course a whole bunch of reasons. It's never just one simple story, and it depends where you are and what group of animals it is that you're looking at. But impacts of widespread use of pesticides, the double whammy of climate change, and good old-fashioned habitat loss are generally the key things that are cited as being important in insect declines, and therefore all of the other challenges that we're seeing in ecosystems today. So if you're an insect, then a bit like us, you need food, you need shelter, you need somewhere to have your offspring, you need somewhere to spend the winter that's safe. And losing any one of these things means that you're not going to be terribly happy if you're an insect. And the photo just illustrates what that means. This is all around us everywhere, and especially southern Ontario. We're seeing certainly patches of really important habitat left, but we're also seeing intensive agriculture. We're seeing roads, we're seeing towns and cities, all these things that we need as humans. But oftentimes we're seeing those things really expanding and encroaching into habitat that the other wildlife actually needs. And I mentioned birds. These are a couple of examples of species that are kind of almost like household names of birds that even if you're not really a keen birder, you probably heard of swallows, you probably heard of kestrels. Both of these guys are declining pretty precipitously in Ontario and beyond, and to the extent that barn swallows are actually listed as threatened in Ontario. And that's pretty heartbreaking and pretty sudden, pretty precipitous. You might wonder about kestrels. The birders among you will not be wondering, but turns out that many birds of prey actually do specialize in insects as well. So kestrels, even red-tailed hawks, will spend some time eating invertebrates along the roadside. And kestrels in particular seem to be suffering from a whole mixture of things, but potentially insect declines could actually be part of that as well. So, and I promise this isn't going to be all doom and gloom, by the way, but we'll get to some more cheerful things shortly. So just a little bit of an introduction into the concept of habitat. Again, I know many of you do not need this kind of introduction, but it is worth breaking it down to the basics, and then a lot more complicated things can make a lot of sense later. So as many of you know, every living thing has evolved to need a specific set of things, like we're talking about the insects before. So shelter, food, places to raise offspring. So we refer to that as habitat. And many things are real generalists, like this American robin was quite happy to build her nest in the traffic light in London a couple of years ago. So you can see these guys all over the place. They're not necessarily springing to mind as something that really needs any help or any conservation concern. But of course, there's other species that are an awful lot more fussy. Pilated woodpeckers could be an example of that, still a common bird, but an animal that needs very specific habitat. It needs forest, prefers big chunks of forest. It needs certain types of food, mostly insect food in those trees for it to survive. And of course, the same is very true of insects. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, is that many insects can only eat one species of plant. They can only visit one type of flower or one color of flower or one shape of flower in order to get the sustenance that they need to survive. And a famous example of that is monarch butterflies, for example. Their caterpillars will only survive if the eggs were laid on any species in the milkweed family. The caterpillars will only survive and grow up to be an adult monarch butterfly if they've been deposited on the right kind of plant. So without milkweed plants, we don't get monarchs, and bye-bye butterflies, and that's not great. And the same is true for many other insects. They have really tight relationships with plants, and sometimes those relationships, we don't even know what those are yet until it can be too late. So similarly, thinking about it in terms of timeframes, then some insects are active in May, others are active in July, others in August, etc., etc. So it's not just about diversity of plants to support diverse insects, it's also about diversity of timing and all those things. So enough words. Here's a pretty picture to try to illustrate that point. It's not very complicated, but this is a photo I took in Keynes Woods in London a few years ago. And the actual names of the plants don't really matter, but the point is that there's lots of different types of plants growing on the forest floor. There's lots of different species of shrub. There's lots of different species of tree in the canopy. So if you're an insect looking for a flower that's of a certain shape, a certain color, with a certain chemical composition of the nectar even, then you're probably going to find something that you will enjoy. However, unfortunately, on the other side of the trail, someone had dumped their compost, and we had just 100% cover of lily of the valley. Now, this is a non-native and can be quite invasive plant that many of us probably have growing happily in our gardens. In that context, it's not really doing much good, but it's not doing a whole lot of harm either. But as soon as it gets out into the wild, then it can completely eradicate habitat for all of that insect biodiversity that we've been talking about. So if you're a wood thrush, or you're a pilated woodpecker, or you're something like that, trying to raise a nest full of hungry little chicks, then you're not going to find very many insects when your forest is carpeted with one non-native invasive plant, compared with on the left, where you're probably going to find a whole bunch of different kinds of food to feed chicks at different times of the year. So that's just an illustration of kind of what I'm talking about. The other fun thing that we need to worry about these days as well is climate change, of course. So the timing of a lot of biological processes is driven by day length, but also sometimes temperature, and sometimes a relationship between temperature and day length. So if there's a warm spring, some types of plants will actually flower earlier in the year. And then if you're an insect and you emerge, then lo and behold, you'll find something to eat. That's great. But not all insects and not all plants actually have that kind of flexibility. So we're starting to see more and more disconnects between the timing of when plants are flowering and when insects are emerging, and in turn, when birds are trying to raise their young. And when all of those things fall out of synchrony, then you end up with an awful lot of hungry birds or an awful lot of hungry insects, which is not ideal. And of course, on top of that, climate change can, of course, exacerbate the spread of non-native invasive plants like that lily of the valley I mentioned, garlic mustard, European buckthorn, Phragmites, all of these fun non-native invasive plants that we're doing our best to manage in natural spaces. Climate change can be a real enemy of those of us that are trying to manage these things as well. So I'm just going to quickly pause. That was a very rapid overview of a whole bunch of different ideas, hopefully some of which are of some interest to some of you. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about who pays my bills at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So many of you are probably familiar with us already. We're Canada's leading land conservation charity. So we're a non-government organization. We're dependent on private donations from individuals, corporations, and we do receive government funding as well. And we primarily acquire, either through purchase or donation, land which provides significant habitat for wildlife. That's kind of the crux of what we do, trying to protect important natural spaces. And since 1962, we've managed to protect somewhere around 14 million hectares of land right across the country, with the incredibly generous support of many donors, many supporters, many partners right across the country. And of course, these numbers keep changing every so often. We'll rejig our database. We'll be working every day to keep managing our data, but we're also working every day to acquire more land. So I think we're about to have a big update and reveal our next new number just in the next few weeks. So it's pretty exciting stuff. Just a quick overview again, this map's a few years out of date now, but you get the idea that we're working right across Canada from coast to coast to coast, mostly focused in the southern edge of Canada, arguably where some of the biggest threats to biodiversity occur, also where we are able to be based and do so much work. Zooming in on Ontario, these green areas are areas where we try to focus our work across the province. And right at the end, I'm going to talk about a couple of exciting new places that we're also starting to focus on. But these areas are places where we have a landscape scale conservation plan, and we're working in those areas to really focus our acquisition and stewardship efforts. And across Ontario, we've supported the acquisition or conservation of over 85,000 hectares of land right across the province. So what are we actually doing? We can't fix all of the threats to pollinators, unfortunately, much as we might like to. Some of these things are just outside of what we're able to achieve. But we know that by addressing some of the key threats to pollinators and other wildlife, we can reduce the relative impact of some of the other problems. So one of the key things that we do is not only do we acquire land and protect it, we actually steward that land forever. We take care of it forever. And what that means, especially down here in southern and southwestern Ontario, is restoration work. So we'll restore habitat in degraded areas, restore it back to some semblance of an ecosystem. And in fact, down here in southern Ontario, we've restored somewhere in the region of 1,000 hectares of former agricultural land back to vibrant habitat, like some of the properties Bill was mentioning at the beginning. So what does that actually look like? This is a bit of a schematic of in Norfolk County, down on the north shore of Lake Erie. We've done quite a lot of really focused restoration work. We acquired several former tobacco farms, picture up in the top left. And once we'd finished that, I will try to find my train of thought again. So we do a bunch of restoration. I think that was where I got to. We take care of the properties forever. This is something we really take pride in. We don't just acquire land and walk away. We produce really detailed property management plans, and then we raise the money that we need to actually implement those plans. And a big part of what that means, and especially southern Ontario, is this kind of restoration work. So converting farmer agricultural land into vibrant, diverse habitats dominated by native plants, and then buzzing with fun wildlife, including bees and birds and all these fun things. So what does it actually look like? This can take the form of a lot of things. It can involve a huge amount of time spending collecting the seeds of native wildflowers, right up to big trees like acorns and other tree nuts and things like that. and then scattering the seeds or individually planting acorns and other nuts, sometimes by hand, sometimes via volunteers, sometimes by machine, depending on the scale of the site and the funds that we've been able to raise to do the work. And other sites will actually augment that kind of seeding with the direct planting of individual little native plants. So this is a very happy volunteer with his tray of some kind of native prairie grass that we were planting, I think, in Rice Lake Plains a few years ago. So not only do we do that, we also, in some cases, will try to restore the structure of the landscape. So especially in Southern Ontario, a lot of the agricultural landscape has been artificially flattened and artificially drained. And where we can, we actually try to reverse that process so that we can hold a bit more water on the landscape for longer into the year. We always do that with great caution, of course. We don't want to flood our neighbors or cause any problems for anybody else, but where it's possible, we'll actually send in some pretty heavy machinery and scoop out hollows like this. And we'll either sow wetland plants around the edge, or sometimes wetland plants do have a habit of just popping out of the ground by magic. And we can create wetland habitats surrounded by also restored upland habitats, which remarkably quickly do get used by all sorts of wildlife, including migratory birds. So of course, the big question is, does this actually work? And of course, I probably wouldn't be here if it didn't work, because I'd be busy trying to work out how to make it work. But this is a photo actually from before my time at NCC, just before I started, of a property in Norfolk County called Lake Erie Farms. This is a property you can go and visit and hike through. It was a tobacco farm. We acquired it and then we restored it back in 2006, 2007. And this was the result in the first year. And I understand many of my colleagues were super nervous about, God, did this really work? What do we do here? But within the first couple of years, all the native plants were coming up. And just a handful of years later, that same area is a super vibrant early successional oak savanna ecosystem. There's baby oak trees, there's native grasses and wildflowers, and it's absolutely teeming with native insects, including bees. And in fact, there was a student many years ago now who did a bit of a survey on bee populations here, and she found over 100 species of bee, most of which were native bee species, just in this one 400-acre farmer tobacco farm. So it's pretty rewarding, and it certainly does seem to work very well. Of course, we're blessed with really great, intense growing seasons, especially in southwestern Ontario. But it's amazing how resilient nature can be if you can give it a little bit of a helping hand here and there. So the next thing we're looking at is, of course, restoration is great, but we're starting to look a bit harder about the exact structure that we're trying to create in terms of plants. So looking harder at the actual species that we're including on these planting lists, making sure that we're creating both the structure that we want, but also that we're homing in on really key host plants for key rare insects. And a key thing that we're looking at right now is New Jersey tea and lupin, like in the photo here. And both of these species are really important for some really rare butterflies, including mottled dusky wing. And some of you might be aware of this, but mottled dusky wing is present in Ontario still, but it's been lost from many, many parts of the province. And there was a hopefully successful reintroduction done this past summer to the Pinery Provincial Park. So we're hoping we can learn a bit more from that and work in partnership with the various folks involved and do some more reintroductions in some recently restored Nature Conservancy of Canada properties. So kind of trying to get a bit more refined with how our restoration works. So if, like me, you haven't discovered yourself owning a 200-acre field that you can restore, then there's still some stuff you can do to help if you want to do so. Certainly, as I've been working with NCC, I found this kind of work super inspiring, and I really wanted to do a little bit of this kind of work in my own backyard at the scale that I could manage. So it's probably obvious by now where I'm going with this, but if you have any kind of space, including a balcony that you can stick a pot on, then choosing a native plant over a non-native plant is one of the key things that we can all do to support biodiversity. Even right in our big urban areas, it still is a good thing to choose to do. Of course, more is better, but just one little native plant in a pot in a balcony is still a great choice. I won't go into detail on this. I'm happy to chat about it afterwards in questions. I'd recommend avoiding cultivars or nativars. Like, try and go for the real thing, the real bona fide native plant and all of its wild glory. There is a bunch of research here and there coming out showing that in some cases, the true wild type native plant does a better job at supporting pollinators, supporting other insects, because sometimes the chemical composition of the plant, the chemical composition of the nectar and things like that is actually very subtly different and doesn't always quite do what native animals have evolved to expect it to do. So I'm just going to jump into a few examples of some well-behaved native plants that, if you're excited about this, you may want to choose. Some of you may already have in your garden already, who knows? In fact, this one right here, hairy beardtongue, is a great sort of sun-loving semi-shade plant that will grow in super dry conditions. This is on a restored field on Pelee Island a few years ago. Actually, before I jump into that, I'm just going to mention as well that if you have a cottage a bit further north, or you're lucky enough to live somewhere where there's a bunch of kind of native semi-wilderness already, then take the time to look around and get to know what's already growing there. Because especially the further north you go in Ontario, then the more intact our ecosystems already are. So you may well be finding that there's actually some cool native plants right there already. And I would recommend don't of course remove things from the wild. Many plants will not be happy if you move them, like orchids, like this thing on the left is a classic example of that. If you transplant an orchid, there's a good chance it will die unless you're really experienced. It's better to leave them in the wild for other people and wildlife to enjoy. So yeah, some examples of things that are increasingly easy to obtain through native plant nurseries, farmers markets. Some conservation authorities are doing plant sales and things as well. There's quite a few commercial nurseries that are now carrying more and more native plants. So if you have a sunny, dry spot, then these two species are some of my top favorites for those kind of conditions: prairie smoke and butterfly weed. They're both fairly low growing, super well behaved, incredibly drought tolerant plants. They will not want you to water them at all. I include the scientific name under the butterfly weed, not to show off that I know what the scientific name is, but just to make the point that there are a lot of species marketed under the name butterfly something or another, butterfly bush, butterfly plant, butterfly whatever. Make sure that if you're wanting to plant native plants that you actually get an Asclepius. This is a native milkweed that will support monarch butterflies. They will lay their eggs, the caterpillars will be successful on these guys. And they're this incredibly beautiful plant as well. And to illustrate this, as you can see, I don't care about my lawn at all. This was a couple of summers ago when it was super droughty. I don't water anything except my vegetables in my garden. So that butterfly milkweed at the back was completely happy with being totally ignored, totally neglected. It chucked out a whole bunch of really beautiful flowers for ages and ages and ages, despite being completely ignored. So that is one of the huge benefits of native plant gardening, is that it is not zero maintenance, but in terms of watering and all those complicated things, then you definitely don't need to bother. If you have some shade, then these are a couple of my favorites. Bluestem Goldenrod is a really lovely woodland goldenrod plant. Now, I told you I would come back to this. It's a very commonly said thing that goldenrod will make you sneeze. But if you remember, I mentioned that if you make a very gaudy or smelly or really visible flower, then the chances are you're trying to attract a pollinator, an animal, rather than trying to send your pollen out on the wind. So this is a great example of that. Goldenrod's flower, in order to attract bees and other insects to come and move their sticky, heavy pollen around. So the chances are you're actually allergic to something else that's flowering at the same time if you're finding yourself sneezing at goldenrod season. Wild columbine is another fabulous woodland plant. It's really well behaved in the garden. I'm not very good at keeping it well behaved, but if you want a nice wild show like this, then this is in my backyard a few years ago. This is a really neat plant because not only will it support native insects, you will also get hummingbirds coming to the flowers. They will come and drink the nectar from these flowers, which is pretty neat. You can jam in an awful lot of different species of plant in a remarkably small space. This is my front yard a few years ago, back when it used to be neat and tidy. I built a kind of rain garden in the middle so I could grow some wetland plants. So I have some pond liner under there to keep the soil really moist. So I can grow things like turtlehead and cardinal flower, the top two left plants here, but right next door I can grow some real drought tolerant stuff like prairie smoke and Greystem goldenrod and things like that. So you can do quite a lot in quite a small space if you're so inclined. And if you're a lot more artistic and actually competent than I am, then you could design some really quite spectacular places and spaces. There really will be a native plant for pretty much any situation. You know, Ontario has a diverse range of ecosystems, and as such has a diverse range of plants that have evolved to take advantage of all of those situations. Another key thing about if you're gardening with wildlife in mind is to not forget about winter. There's an awful lot of important processes happen in the winter. So if you're kind of lazy like me, then you're in luck, because that really is one of the best things you can do over winter is leave those dead seed heads, leave the stems, leave the leaf litter, all of that kind of stuff. Those things are supporting all sorts of mostly invertebrate life, pollinators, moths, goodness knows what in there. So do your best to not tidy up, preferably not at all, to be honest, but certainly not until late into the spring when all of these really, really important animals have had a chance to emerge and do their thing for the season. So that's one idea of things that you might want to try in your home. Just another little spot of doom and gloom, but then I promise we'll get positive again, is a note on birds. I know many of you are probably like me and pretty into birds, and perhaps therefore super familiar with this, but if not, it's worth thinking about some of the things that are going on specifically in the bird world right now. There's a lot of things that are directly killing birds in Canada every single year. And one of the things that we hear quite a lot about, for example, is wind turbines. And it's estimated that they probably kill about 16 million birds a year, which sounds like an awfully large number, and it really is rather a large number. But I understand that there's a lot of work happening to try to reduce that number further. Things with better planning of where these things go and better planning with timing of when they're switched on and things. However, it's not the only problem. Another problem that our little birds are facing is smacking into our windows every year. And that's estimated to kill somewhere around 22 million birds. You'll see different estimates depending on which piece of research you're looking at, but somewhere in that ballpark is birds that are flying into our windows every single day. Well, not necessarily every single day, mostly during migration, but nonetheless, it's a bigger impact. However, by far the most important thing is actually this guy. Outdoor cats, including your friendly pet cat that goes outside, is estimated that they kill about between 200 and 300 million birds every single year just in Canada. And that's obviously a horrifically unsustainable number. And one of the key things, of course, that we can do about that is to not let our cats outside. I'm sure you must have heard this many times before, but I'm going to say it again. If you have a cat, then do see what you can do to reduce the time it spends outside. Particularly if you're going to get excited about native plant gardening, then in some ways it becomes a lot less relevant if you end up also with an outdoor cat. So just something to bear in mind when you're thinking about the whole ecosystem. Then there's an awful lot of things going on that you can potentially influence really quite easily from home. So just a quick series of pictures to illustrate what you could do here. I've talked already about a lot of Nature Conservancy of Canada's work and our restoration work at scale. You might want to get excited about native plant gardening at home. Do consider keeping your cat indoors. You could build a fun catio like our little guys have here in London. Another thing that I haven't actually talked about, but I will throw in there, is if you're out and about visiting natural areas at all and you have a dog, then please do keep your dog on leash. Even if your dog is friendly and you think it's not going to harm anything, then it can actually have quite a devastating impact on other people's enjoyment of their hike that day. It can also have quite a devastating impact on wildlife pretty much any time of the year, but there's obviously some times of year that are a bit more sensitive than others. They can also, something we often don't think about as much, is they can also really contribute to moving invasive species around. So as soon as your dog gets stuff caught in its paws and caught in its fur, and it goes tearing off the trail or all over the place, then it's contributing to moving those non-native plants around in the ecosystem. So just lots of angles of things to think about in your everyday life that sometimes might just take a very small tweak in the way you operate and the way you think about things. So switching gears yet again to a super exciting current opportunity that NCC is busy working on right now. I mentioned earlier right at the beginning that we have these key areas right across the province where we're really focusing our efforts. And we've actually just started working in a new one of those, a new natural area, which we're calling the Central Ontario Corridors Natural Area. It's this area kind of between Adirondack Park and Algonquin Park. And it's an area that if you zoom out on a continental scale, you can actually see it's quite an important kind of connection area between lots of different types of ecosystems on a continental scale, in fact. I'm just going to flip to the next slide. So the actual specific opportunity is that we have this incredible opportunity to help protect 5,000 hectares of land, which we can protect pretty much immediately, which is a huge amount of land in the grand scheme of things compared with the work that we've done to date in Ontario. The owner of a new venture called Landescapes is actually donating over $9 million worth of the land value, which is just an incredible amount of generosity. And it's not just these little red parcels that you can see that are not so little, in fact, they're colossal. The surrounding landscape is also areas of crown land that are being managed reasonably sympathetically with regards to biodiversity conservation. So the impact of this land acquisition is greater than simply just those hectares, even though that in itself is actually really big. We're hugely excited about this area because it has been an area of really great importance culturally for Indigenous people for a very, very long time, of course. Unfortunately, the previous landowners, previous to the gentleman that we're working with today, didn't tend to facilitate very much access for Indigenous people. So we're super excited looking forward to better engage with Indigenous communities in this area and beyond, to work out some neat innovative ways to work together to better facilitate access for traditional cultural practices on these properties. Of course, working at the speed of trust, and really excited to see if we can contribute in our own small way to some degree of reconciliation via conservation, one step at a time as best we can. Of course, it's really important for biodiversity as well. There's extensive interior forest habitat with big wetland areas and river systems and so forth. Lots of wide-ranging mammals, including, in fact, a reintroduced elk population, which are doing super well. So conserving this habitat is going to be really exciting to help support that population. Of course, lots of species of rare breeding birds, turtles, rare plants, the whole works. So we're super excited about this. There's a small problem of needing to raise $3 million by this spring. So if you are so inclined and so excited by this kind of project and are interested in supporting it in any way, then do give me a shout. We'd be super excited to chat with you. And we're really hoping to be able to announce a successful acquisition of these properties sometime over the next few months, if we're able to be successful with the fundraising. So just an exciting big project to kind of leave you with this evening. And with that, I will end it there and be excited to take any questions that have come up. Assuming that my audio didn't die again and that you can actually still hear me.
Yeah, thanks, Mhairi. That was excellent. We have, I see one question there. I'm sure there'll be more, but I have quite a few comments based on your talk. Made me think about a lot of things. And one was when you talked about the pollen, when what I know is up at the cabin that I have that's up near Deep River on the Ottawa River. I think it's mostly white pine and it's mostly in June, but when it sheds pollen, and especially when the wind's going the right direction on certain lakes, just the amount of pollen that collects on the lake shore, it's just incredible. It's just, it almost looks, like you said, like a contaminant, but it is part of nature. And that's normal.
Yeah, I was amazed the first time I saw that up in Lake Superior. I couldn't believe how, I've seen it a little bit in Scotland here and there with Scots pine that do a similar thing, but we chopped most of our forest down a long time ago. So it was exciting to see a proper ecosystem still doing that here. Yeah.
Yeah. And in regards to pollen, it was good that you mentioned I mean, most naturalists know about goldenrod not being at all a problem in allergies, but we still have to, reinforce it. I mean, I was a pharmacist before I retired, and I used to always have to tell people that goldenrod is not an issue, but it was difficult when you'd get a product like Celdane, and on the packaging on their box, they'd have goldenrod all over their packaging. So it almost like it was a loss, so much disinformation, which we're all so familiar about.
For sure, it's a real challenge, and that's why I often try to take the opportunity to raise these things again, just to kind of reaffirm it, even though I have no doubt that all of you have way more expertise on many of these things than I do. So, yeah.
And I'm often out bird watching, and I'm often out in natural areas, walking through woodlands, and I'm struck by how often I encounter these monocultures of these non-natives. You mentioned lily of the valley. Yeah, you see a lot of that, but periwinkle is another one that's really bad.
For sure.
And I'm noticing a lot more Japanese knotweed now. I think it's really starting to spread. And because I used to think, well, no, it's not a problem. It's just here and there, it's small little colonies. But I'm starting to see more and more swaths of it along the Grand River here in Brantford. So I suspect it's going to become more of a problem as the years go by. And this kind of leads into another question. Well, not another question, but a question I have for you in regards to NCC properties. When you create the little wetlands that you were talking about, invariably you're going to have Phragmites come into many of these. What does the NCC does in terms of Phragmites management on their properties?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, whenever you create habitat, you also create habitat for nasty invasives like Phragmites, and you're absolutely right. It's a real problem as soon as we create wetland, you kind of switch off the engine of the backhoe and pretty much the frag is established already. So as part of our really rigorous stewardship work, we keep a really close eye on everything that we do. We keep an eye on our properties, but we also particularly pay attention to anything that we actually do. So in that situation, that is basically the first monitoring trip is getting ready to document Phragmites and depending on the habitat that it's growing in, work out what the best management tools are to eradicate it as quickly as possible. Ideally, we get it out of there fast, which probably means killing it every single year before it establishes and destroys the whole wetland system again. There's a whole bunch of different techniques that you can use to control Phragmites. If you go to the Ontario Invasive Plant Council website, they've just recently published their best management practices. It was just updated back in 2020. So there's a whole bunch of pretty good detail about how to control it there. It depends on what tools that you have access to and the scale of the problem. You can use a mixture of mechanical control if it's growing in standing water or chemical control if it's on dry land. We're super excited that we now have a chemical product that's been registered for use in Canada that is safe to use in aquatic environments. So that's suddenly revolutionized our ability to manage Phragmites out of even very sensitive ecosystems because it's a very effective and safe tool to use in that situation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's good news, what you say there about that herbicide for Phragmites, because to my mind, Phragmites is almost the worst thing that has happened to Ontario in terms of invasives. I mean,
well, it is cited as being Canada's worst invasive species or worst invasive plant, at least. So absolutely, it's bad news, but there is a lot of work happening to manage it. You probably started to see dead patches of it along some of the highways in the area. There's more and more conservationists able to manage it in wetlands. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's never too late, obviously, but had they addressed the problem 25 years ago. Yep. I mean, I can relate the story where in Algonquin Park, where my daughter worked, that Phragmites started to come in along Highway 60. but the park was not allowed to do anything about it because it was the responsibility of the MTO, the Ministry of Transportation. So there was a bit of a lag before anything was done because the park itself could not do anything about it. But fortunately, the MTO this year apparently was out spraying it. So,
Oh, great.
but it's just bizarre that you would have these jurisdictional battles over something like Phragmites.
It's one of the biggest challenges actually with frag because it occupies lots of different types of habitat and it requires a huge amount of collaboration to deal with it between different landowners and different jurisdictions. And it's actually something we have a project both in Norfolk County, but also on the Bruce Peninsula, where we have an invasive species team that will go out and help landowners manage Phragmites on their properties. So if you have property or you're interested in invasive species control in particular in those two areas, then we may have a team to help. So
okay, great. Just a couple of more things too that I thought I'd mention too with your talk, in that I encourage everybody to go to this property called Lake Erie Farms. It's near the little village of Walsingham. It's to the west. I'm not sure the concession number, whether it's concession 4. It's a few miles to the west, and it's a very big property. It's a very good walk to go through the property. And if you go there in the summertime, you'll see a profusion of wildflowers. It's just simply incredible. Couple reasons that I know of it. Well, I got introduced to it when there was a rare dragonfly that was found there. Nothing to do with the prairie aspect of it, but it was just found in the ravine that traverses the property called the tiger spiketail. So I went to see that, and that was the first time that I saw the property, and it was simply amazing. But I also saw a live plant there called Venus Looking Glass, which is a plant that I always wanted to see. Not a particularly striking plant, but very interesting in its growth form. And I'd seen it in Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, and I knew other people who'd seen it, and I always wanted to see this plant. And I saw it there, but it is planted. It's part of the plants that were part of the with all the other plants that were planted. So it's not really all that countable. So, but anyway, that's another aspect of it. I should mention too that mottled duskwing, there is a population in Halton that is. I'm not sure if it's still thriving, but there were good numbers of this butterfly at the population a few years ago. So hopefully it is doing well. It has been managed, but it's been kept kind of quiet because they're worried about collectors actually collecting butterflies, which is really on the wane, but I guess there's still some people that would do that. And I've sort of got into the mantra of not tidying up my yard either, because it's easy to do because it's kind of a lazy aspect. I recall in the past, 40% of my backyard was just perennials, just growing wild, a lot of them native. And every fall I used to cut them all down. It used to be almost a full day job to cut them down. Now I leave them just because it's a heck of a lot easier to leave them. And then in the spring, I've got this lovely tool that I found discarded by a roadside. It's this huge, big screen with heavy wire gauge, which I can just use, and I just keep flopping it over, and it compresses everything, and keep doing it. I can knock everything down in the spring in about 10 minutes, as opposed to an all-day job in the past. And I'd like to think too that there's this doom and gloom aspect which we're all inundated with, and we have to try and stay positive, point out these success stories. And there was an article in the Globe and Mail on the weekend by Marcus G. He's a birder, bit of a birder, but his article was "There are Reasons for Hope Amid Environmental Gloom." And he went through some examples. And sometimes it sort of recharges us to read these stories, to know that there are good stories out there. And we talked about, all the extinction that's going on, but he mentioned some examples like the species called the black-browed babbler in Indonesia, which hadn't been seen since the 1840s. And it was just recently rediscovered in 2020. And of course, he listed some examples, of course, which we all know about, whooping crane and how that's come back. So we have to try and remain positive, if for no other reason, to keep ourselves involved in wanting to fight to maintain our habitats and our species. As he did mention that a lot of young people right now think the battle is already lost, which if you get into that kind of mindset, then it does become hopeless. We can make meaningful changes, as you've pointed out. So I'll get off my high horse here about things, and we do have a few questions, so I'll try and get in here. Okay, so I'm not sure what order they came in. Let's see, I guess the time would be a good thing. Okay, Susan McMillan asked, can you comment on exotic alpine gardens? Many gardeners of these say they have lots of pollinators to these flowers, even though they are from all over the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in my mind, I have a kind of gradient from concrete is pretty useless. Lawn is better than concrete. Non-native plants are better than lawn, and native plants are better than all of those put together. So absolutely, you'll see all sorts of wildlife using all sorts of non-native, including sometimes some of our nasty invasive plants. You will see wildlife making use of them to some extent. And that's okay in a garden setting. Then you can pretty much do what you like in a garden setting. The trouble is that there's all sorts of subtle differences that those non-native plants might have that mean that they're not actually doing a great job of supporting wildlife. So there have been studies, I think I mentioned this briefly, there have been some studies looking at the actual nutritional value of different types of nectar produced by different flowers. And lo and behold, they've found that if you're, for example, a hummingbird in a specific part of the world, then your nutritional requirements are met perfectly by the native flowers that are flowering at the time that you are breeding or migrating or whatever it is. Whereas even very similar non-native plants may just not quite give you the nutrients that you need. And you can measure things like that by looking at, for example, the immune system of the bird or the animal, whatever it is. You can actually measure the ability of an animal to mount an immune response to a challenge. And if you've had the right diet, the right food, and in this case, the right plant, then you can mount an immune challenge effectively and efficiently and quickly without too much drama. Whereas if you're not eating quite the right food, then you're not as well equipped to do that. And some of these things probably don't actually matter, but the problem is sometimes they really do matter, and we might not actually know that until it's a bit too late. So do what you like in your garden, but if your main objective is to support native wildlife, then I'd strongly recommend shifting to native local plants as best you can. But I love exotic alpine plants as well, so I'm not about to say turn around and rip it out, but just think about what your goals might be, especially if you're setting out in a new gardening expedition or something like that. Then think about whether your objective is the garden or your objective is supporting wildlife. And of course, it's not even in question when it comes to like field scale restoration work, like what we do. We're always using native, fairly local genotypes of native plants for that kind of restoration work. So I don't know if that helps, but some idea of an answer.
That's good. Lynn asked, how do we donate to the Central Ontario Corridor Natural Area Project?
Oh, that is a great question. Thank you so much for your interest in that. Your best bet, I think I'm still sharing my screen, so feel free to just drop me an email and I will connect you with a little bit more information about the project if you're interested, and we'll send you a link to the right spot of the website. You can also just visit our website, natureconservancy.ca, and navigate your way into donate. And I think there's an opportunity to state that you want your donation to go to Ontario region, and then hopefully a little section where you can write more specifically the project that you're interested in. But I know that's a lot to take in verbally, so do feel free to drop me an email and I'll send you a much more specific web link if that would be helpful. But thank you so much for your interest.
Okay, and from Jackson, a comment and question. Amazing presentation, thank you so much. Wondering about your NCC teams. What do your science and education teams look like? Also curious about how you incorporate volunteers or eBird or iNaturalist into your work. So two questions, but the first one is about what do your science and education teams look like?
Right, great question, and thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. So in terms of our staff structure, each of those natural areas, those green areas on that map early on, we have 1 or 2 conservation biologists that are responsible for taking care of our properties. So they're out in the field a bunch. They're also in the office a bunch too. They're writing property management plans and they're implementing those plans. They're often joined with a team of summer techs or interns, and by summer sometimes we mean from January to December, but primarily during the kind of growing season months where we have often university students, college students that are coming out for the summer with us. Those teams are then in turn supervised by program directors, and those individuals they're kind of responsible for the land acquisition. They're responsible for directing the fundraising that we need to do for each of those focused areas. I'm in this kind of parallel universe with the program directors where I'm not tied to any specific geography other than the whole province, but I'm kind of trying to support all of those field teams in terms of how they're thinking about the biodiversity they're trying to support, thinking about the science that needs to be going into the decisions that we're making, both in terms of acquisition, but also stewardship of those properties. And then in parallel to me again, we have a team of development and communications experts who are fundraising, who are supporting some of the media stuff that we do and that kind of thing. And I'm going to maybe kind of guess that part of your question is maybe asking about what our educational backgrounds are, perhaps, but just quickly, we're kind of all over the place. I happen to have a PhD in ecology, and I find that I'm using the project management and all that stuff that I've gained from that all the time in my job, which is not the same as actually needing a PhD to do my job, but it certainly gives me some help. The sub-regional and field staff, then they come from quite a mixture of backgrounds. Some of them have research-based masters, some of them have college diplomas, some of them have a mixture of all of those things all mixed together in a bucket. Some have come from completely different sectors, but many have been field biologists throughout their careers. So it's quite a diversity of backgrounds that we have on our team, which is super cool. And in our development communications team, then we have, again, a mixture of people that are coming purely from a fundraising career and are just interested in natural history and conservation kind of on their own time, if you like. Others are coming at it from more of a biological background, if that makes sense. So I also forgot to mention, of course, the people actually report to me. We have several GIS experts on our team here in Ontario. So they have, again, a mixture of backgrounds. They've done various GIS specializations at school, but also some other biological studies. And they're responsible for managing all of our field data that we collect. They take data from the field staff and they process it into really quite impressive maps, like some of the ones I was showing you today, actually. They will take individual species occurrence data, they'll take land cover data, and we'll do all sorts of cool things with those data to answer questions like, how much forest cover is there in this area, and what will our restoration contribute to, how will it contribute to percent cover of forest or grassland or wetland in this area. So really diverse mixture of people and backgrounds on the team. And then the other part of the question about volunteers, eBird, and iNaturalist, great question. If you're on an NCC property, please do submit to eBird and iNaturalist. I'm slightly obsessed with both of those platforms, and I hope that many of you are as well. We do keep an eye on those data. Unfortunately, we don't have quite enough staff to do as much as we would prefer with those data, but in some ways that doesn't matter, because as long as those data are submitted by you when you're out having fun, we can tap into those data at any point when we do have capacity to do so. And it's really by far the best way to get information to us about something cool that you've seen on an NCC property, or conversely about something bad that you've seen. So if you find knotweed or you find Phragmites, please do stick it into iNaturalist, because that's the first step to actually being able to do something about it, is knowing that it's there. And in terms of volunteers in general, then we do have a volunteer program. We've obviously had to evolve that quite considerably during COVID. We did have a few very, very small in-person volunteer events over the last year or so. Not quite sure what the spring is going to look like everybody else. My crystal ball is a bit crappy. But there are always opportunities to help us out. If you're interested, drop me an email, look us up online and get in touch, and we can work something out. But especially if you live near an NCC property, just going out and spending time, even hiking the trails, letting us know if there's a tree down over it, iNaturalizing and e-birding on our properties is actually hugely valuable. So do have at it in that regard. Hopefully that was a good answer or a long answer.
Very good. The next question is just a comment from Gordon McNulty. I'm really impressed with the tremendous work of the NCC, and kudos to Mhairi for a fine presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really nice to hear your kind words. Thank you.
Here. And for Jennifer Lenny, I have a very shady yard and am excited to add many shade-loving natives next year. There is a significant amount of sad-looking lawn. Besides making the lawn smaller, do you have any suggestions on native ground covers that would do well here? The mosses are growing amongst the grass here and there, but not enough to cover it all.
Right, yeah, good question. So I can give you a few rough ideas, and by all means drop me an email and I can either connect you with others that know more than I, or think of some more stuff. The photo that is in the background on the slide that we're seeing right now is a bunch of shade-loving plants. It's not exactly ground cover, but it depends on how much foot traffic it's going to get. But the kind of heart-shaped leaves are wild ginger, which is a great woodland ground covery kind of a thing. And these bigger things are false Solomon seal, which is a slightly taller woodland plant. So those are good options. If it's an area that gets a bit more foot traffic, then there's a couple of native wild strawberries that are really good at spreading and covering the ground really quickly. And if you make it out there before the chipmunks do, then you will get a really nice reward of really yummy native wild strawberries. So I have a little one that produces a white fruit, which is really delicious. I have no idea why they never make it into the kitchen, but they just don't. They just don't make it into the kitchen because they make it into my belly first. So that's a good ground cover. There's a bunch of native violets as well that you could look into. Just beware there are some non-native violets as well. So try and find your local native plant nursery and see if you can get some native violets. That's a few ideas to be going on with it, and there's nothing wrong with moss. I mean, I don't know my mosses at all, I'm afraid, but there are some native mosses that are presumably supporting some kind of wildlife and certainly look really pretty too. You could also try some sedges. There's a few. There's a sedge for every situation as well. If it's fairly dry, then there's a fairly common sedge called Pennsylvania sedge, which is basically looks like a little grass, but you don't need to mow it, and it produces these little subtle flowers. So that could be a good option as well. But yeah, there's a few ideas anyway. But feel free to drop me an email, and I'll see what else I can come up with.
A question from Jim Stollard. So this could take quite a bit to answer, I think. So maybe just concentrate on one property. How are all the NCC properties managed? Restorations, invasive plant and wildlife management, and significant species monitoring. So maybe if you could just do that in one property and just in a nutshell.
Sure. Well, in a nutshell, then yes, we do pretty much all of those things depending on the situation. As soon as we acquire a property, we send our field biologists out to document what is there currently. So they're looking primarily for rare stuff and invasive stuff. And they're also looking for things like trails and signs and garbage dumps and old buildings and all that kind of anthropogenic or human stuff. And they'll pull all those data together into a management plan, which details what they think we need to do for the next 5 years to improve biodiversity on the site. So if it's a property that has an agricultural field on it, for example, then we will have a stewardship action in that plan to restore that field when we've been able to raise enough money to do so. And that will provide information to us about whether they think it should be a forest restoration or a grassland restoration or a prairie restoration, or if there's space for a wetland or whatever. Non-native invasive plant management is a given. That is something that we always do as best we can on our properties. That's part of that PMP processes that will work out what species are there and then follow various published best management practices and best available science to work out how to manage those plants in the most effective and efficient way possible. And in terms of rare species, then yeah, absolutely, we'd love to monitor everything, of course, but we just don't have the capacity to do all of the things. So we will try to focus on whatever species it is that is most important on that property. So something that is really dependent on that property for habitat, for example. And that's actually, to go back to some of the previous questions, then that's actually where eBird and iNaturalist can be really important. So if it's a property that's available for public access, which actually is most of them, then tapping into that community science system is really helpful for us to do some kind of on the side monitoring, if you like. So yeah, it depends on the property. It depends on what the ecological needs actually are, and we do our best to keep pretty focused and fundraise to support those science-based stewardship actions as best we can.
Okay. And Jim had a follow-up question. How many staff do you have Canada-wide?
Oh, that is a good question. I think we're somewhere between 350 and 400 staff across the country. And that changes up the way generally during the summer when we're joined by interns and summer technicians that help us out in the field. So yeah, we're small but big is what people say. Not enough is actually the real answer, is that we wish we had more capacity to do more things more quickly and more efficiently, but we do our best with the staffing that we have.
Okay. I guess there's no more questions. So Mhairi, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the Hamilton Naturalist Club for joining us tonight and giving us this great presentation on the NCC and the fine work that they do. You've given us a lot to think about. I had some more notes written down to mention, but I think seeing us 9 o'clock, we've taken up enough of members' time and your time, Mhairi. So thanks again for coming, and I will fire you an email if I see that glaucous winged gull on the grant for tomorrow.
Thank you.
So that you know that just to keep your interest in seeing that bird. So, so thanks again.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for all of your questions and interest. And do feel free to email me about the glaucous winged gull, but also about anything else. If you've got questions that you didn't get to tonight, then don't hesitate to drop me an email.
We have one more question. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it's a comment, and I echo this entirely. Excellent. This is from Susan McMillan. Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all of the kind words. It means a lot, and it's a real pleasure to be here and share some fun stories. So,
okay, thanks, Mhairi.